Welcome to City Minutes, where we discuss new research that helps us understand the UK's largest cities and towns and policy ideas to improve their economic performance. I'm your host, Andrew Carter from the think tank Centre for Cities. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to this episode of City Minutes. Today I'm joined by my colleague Oscar Selby, who's the author of our latest report called Follow the Money, Explaining the Performance of London's Suburban High Streets. Welcome, Oscar.
Thanks, Andrew.
So we're going to talk about suburban high streets and how they're getting on. Obviously, this is a subject and an issue that we've done quite a lot of work on over at least the last 5 or 6 years, probably going back towards before COVID. So just provide a bit of context for that, and then we can talk about the latest report.
Definitely. So at Centre for Cities, we're very interested in high streets. We think high streets sort of function as a bellwether for local economies. They're a very visible indicator of whether a local economy is doing well or whether it's struggling. Over the years, like you said, we've done lots of different research, done stuff on business rates, for example, arguing for simplification, further devolution. More recently, we've done some research into high street performance and looking at the factors that explain variation. We were specifically looking at city centre high street performance. But in this piece of research, we wanted to look beyond the city centre, to zoom in on one place, looking at London, and to understand how suburban high streets are affected by different factors.
Yeah, so as you say, we've typically looked at the city centres or the high streets of city centres across the country. But this particular piece of work actually looks at non-city centre high streets in one place, which is London. So the suburban high streets of London.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's say a little bit about how we did it. There's a sort of commonality, consistency of the way that we think about these things and some of the data that we've used, which we can see in this report as well. So just say a little bit about how we actually went about doing the piece of work.
Yes, there are lots of different ways to measure high street performance, lots of normative ways, whether it meets your needs. We wanted to try and be as data focused as possible. And so we took the indicator, which was high street vacancy rates. So basically the share of high street space that's empty. That was our main indicator to look at high street performance. And then we also looked at rateable values as an indicator of demand for space, because they basically tell you what rental prices are like on different high streets. When rateable values are high, there's strong demand for space from businesses, and you assume that high streets are therefore performing relatively well. We took these indicators, mapped them across 545 distinct high streets in suburban London, lots of data points to investigate. And then we used lots of different indicators to try and understand what factors drive that geographical variation. So the main thing we used was this enormous credit and debit card spending data set that we've used for a few reports recently. And then we combine that with some business rate filings data on use classes to try and get an understanding of high street composition and the types of businesses that are on different high streets. We also had access to some phone signal data, which could tell us about footfall. And then we paired that with broader economic indicators on income, on commuting patterns, and a variety of other things.
Great. So we're going to just run through some of the headline findings. Obviously, there's lots of detail in the report, which you can find on our website, centreforcities.org, with lots of variation, lots of case studies, lots of different issues being discussed. But let's just run through some of the big headlines. So start us off with the big headline around vacancy rates and what's going on in suburban London, I suppose, and how does suburban London compare to city centre high streets in other cities?
That's a good question. Sort of puts it in context. I think it's a good idea. So what we found is that if you look at both vacancy rates and rateable values, so this indicator of demand for space, London is doing a lot better than the rest of the country. So the average rateable value on a suburban high street is almost twice the average rateable value on a suburban high street outside London. In fact, 46 of the 58 cities in England and Wales have an average rateable value that's lower than the weakest high streets in London. So there's a lot more demand for space on London's high streets. The vacancy rate on suburban London's high streets is between 8 and 10%. We think that's probably a pretty healthy number. If it was at 0, we'd be worried about shortages. But if it was higher to something like Newport, where almost 1 in 5, so 20% of shops are empty, it'd be a lot more concerning.
Yeah, so that's an important point. We're trying to provide a comparative picture. So showing even the suburban high streets that are struggling many of them are still doing better than the premier high streets in city centres in other cities across the country.
Yeah, that's definitely true. The suburban high streets in London are doing a lot better than city centres across the country. And we'd expect city centres broadly to do better than suburban high streets.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because they have more customers.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the big picture finding. We also, as we say in the title, want to try and understand what's driving those numbers, what's driving the patterns. So say a little bit about some of those factors that are driving the performance of the different high streets that we looked at.
Yeah, definitely. So we identified three broad factors as being really important in sort of explaining this geographical variation in high street performance. The first of these factors is catchment size. So we calculated catchments using the spending data, and we identified them using neighborhoods. So we said that a neighborhood is in a high street's catchment if its residents do a sufficient amount of spending on that high street to qualify. Catchments are a good indicator of footfall, and they sort of tell you how many potential customers a high street business can sell to. So we found if we looked at Wood Green and compared it to Catford, for example, Wood Green has a pretty enormous catchment compared to Catford, primarily because of geography. So Wood Green has this large area north of it into Enfield where there aren't so many primary high streets, aren't so many major retail centres. So it's able to pull in all of these people. Catford, on the other hand, is sort of squeezed in between Lewisham, Deptford, Beckenham. It's got lots of competition. So its catchment is around 700,000 people smaller than Wood Green's. Another aspect to what sort of drives footfall variation between those two places, though, is that Catford has 50,000 fewer people living within 1 kilometre of it, which means that the residential density sort of restricts the number of local residents that are regularly spending on the high street as well.
Yeah, so fewer people living practically right next to it, and a smaller catchment, which broadly is about just the amounts of people that in theory and in practice can come onto that high street and spend doing whatever they want to do when they get onto that high street. So that's one sort of variable. Let's talk a little bit about money, so income as the sort of second variable. Just unpack that and how that interacts then with vacancy rates.
Yeah, exactly. So like you say, the number of customers is important, but what's also really important, what's actually more important we found when we looked across London, is the amount of money in those people's pockets. So how much money they were earning in a year, and then how much they were spending on housing. So how much money they had left over to spend on the high street. So an example of places that who have variation or high street performance that are really well explained by this factor would be Hounslow and Ilford. So Hounslow and Ilford are both pretty large high streets in outer London. They've got a similar demographic within their catchment, so similar age. They've got similar numbers of people within their catchment, but the average resident in Hounslow's catchment has £4,200 more to spend on the high street at the end of the year compared to the average resident in Ilford's catchment. And as a result, Ilford has twice as many empty shops and significantly lower rateable values than Hounslow.
Yeah, so that again, that's a sort of added dimension, which is the first one is about size and how many people, but then the second factor is it's not just about how many people, it's how much money they've got, disposable income particularly, and the propensity to spend in a given place. So let's look at the third variable, which is actually about visitors and the degree to which high streets of different types are more or less attractive to visitors as well. So just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when we looked at our catchments and we compared them to footfall, we found that there was a really strong positive relationship. But there were some high streets where footfall was larger than the catchment would suggest. And this means that there are people on the high street that aren't necessarily from the local area. So these are visitors, really. And we were able to find them in this phone signal data, which is really helpful. We found that visitors are a really important part of demand on London's high streets. And they're particularly important in topping up demand on some of the best performing high streets. So the high streets with the lowest vacancy rates and the highest rents almost always have lots of visitors. And these visitors don't just increase demand, they also facilitate a wider amenity mix. They support businesses that can provide a wider variety of goods and services. So instead of just having local supermarkets or corner shops, when you get lots of visitors, you tend to get more retailers, high value retailers, you tend to get more restaurants, more pubs and bars.
And you're talking about places like Notting Hill or Portobello Road,
Exactly.
Those kind of places, which in some respects are internationally renowned, not just nationally renowned. And they're drawing in people from well outside of London to go to those places, which then drives the kind of the patterns that you've just set out.
Exactly, yeah. Those are exactly the places we identified. It's not necessarily something that's achievable for every single suburban high street, but there is certainly scope for expansion within suburban London to attracting more visitors.
Yeah, okay. So let's turn to think about implications and policy. So if you think about those sort of three areas, catchment size, income, and then visitors, just take us through some of the policy sort of thoughts or reflections on that.
So I think that the implications for policy can sort of be split into two chunks. So the first is what this tells us about high streets more broadly and across the country. And then the second is how we can use this information to help high streets in London specifically. So across the country, this really reiterates something that we've already said in previous research, which is that high streets are an outcome of the wider economy. So London's high streets are doing better than the rest of the country, primarily because people have more money, because the urban form facilitates more density, there's better transport infrastructure, and there's more international visitors. This wider economic success is why high streets are doing well. It's not necessarily a unique characteristic to the high streets themselves. So that's the national implication. The London specific implication sort of comes in two broad chunks. So the first is about incomes, and to raise incomes to support the high street, you have to sort of do two things. You've got to raise wages and you've got to improve housing affordability. So in terms of wages, what we found is that catchments with the highest incomes almost always have the most residents who are working or commuting in central London. So it's these jobs in the city centre that really provide the high wages that boost and support the high street in suburban London. So we think that policy should take steps to try and make sure there's enough space within central London, enough commercial space to allow businesses to expand, to employ new people. So that means supporting grade A office development in particular, which is in a shortage at the moment, by doing a variety of different things, whether that's loosening some sightline restrictions potentially around key stations like New Elizabeth Line stations in Farringdon, which have enormous labour markets, enormous potential, but are sort of being underutilised at the moment. So we think that's one of the main ways we can help increase the number of high-paying jobs and grow wages in London.
And just on that, Oscar, because that's a similar pattern that we see more broadly, right, which is city centres supporting suburbs. Our other work obviously shows us that city centres and cities more generally are supporting towns and villages outside them through this labour market effect. People might be working in one place, earning their money there, but they take it somewhere else in order to spend it. And that applies in suburban London, where many people who are living in suburban London, or a good chunk of them are maybe working in the centre of London. They earn their money there, but they take it back and they shop in their various suburbs.
Definitely. It's really important. We looked at the number of jobs within suburban areas to see if that impacted high street performance and rateable values, because that's something that's also quite useful. And it did have an effect. You did find higher rents and lower vacancies on suburban high streets that have more jobs nearby, but it wasn't as substantial as connectivity to city centre jobs, which was far more important. So yes, it's important to bring some of those jobs out to the suburbs to try and increase footfall during the day. But if you really want to raise wages, you need to get those high productivity jobs, which tend to locate in the city centre.
Yeah. So if the first sort of big implication is around boosting wages, creating money, the second sort of implication and policy set of issues is actually reducing costs. So say something about that.
Exactly. I think if you want to talk about incomes in London, you're not going to talk about housing, you're really missing something. So the average house in London now costs 12 times the average annual salary. Everyone's aware there's a housing crisis in London, and this is because there's a housing shortage. We don't have enough homes. The mayor admits this. He knows that we need to deliver new homes, and it's a big part of his agenda, which is a really good thing. But there are things that are getting in the way of that. So, there's big geopolitical factors. You've got supply chain problems that are raising costs. High interest rates are making it hard for developers to deliver. These are difficult things for policy to get a grip of. But what policymakers can do now is make changes to the planning system so that they can encourage more development and help private sector builders provide more homes. So there's a variety of different ways they can do this. Policymakers can use local development orders. So planning authorities can grant permitted development rights to specific sites that meet certain desirable characteristics. Maybe these are minimum density requirements, for example. This can all help provide new homes. Parliament and the GLA can also take steps to try and reduce anti-supply measures in the planning system. So these are things like reducing minimum space requirements or reducing the limitations around dual aspect requirements as well. So these are just small things that can help private sector house builders deliver. The other thing policy can do is, and it's something that, again, the mayor has been pretty vocal on recently, but it's important that it gets delivered, is releasing Greenbelt for residential development, substantial amounts of Greenbelt, so that we can allow London to grow outwards and meet the demand for housing that it needs. And then when that Greenbelt development occurs, we need to make sure that the land value capture that's done on that development is maximised to pay for social and affordable housing that can improve affordability in the short term.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Get a final thought on a couple of other things, because both of those things, absolutely right, obviously, are not really about what's going on the high street itself, right? It's about the conditions that actually facilitate and enable high streets to respond and adapt, not just to continue as they are. We see lots of adaptation and lots of change. But one of the sort of interesting ongoing conversation we touch on a little bit in the report is actually about the desirability of different uses on different high streets. Yeah. And we've got something to say about that, or at least a set of issues that need to be considered. So just say a little bit more around that, because there's clearly a sort of ambition, particularly in policy circles, that say, certain uses on high streets are less or more desirable, and there are always trade-offs associated with those kinds of things. But we touch on it in the report, but just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good point. I think within high street policy, it's definitely very relevant at the moment. So Recently, MHCLG, so government, announced new powers for local authorities in their Pride in Place initiative. A variety of different measures were taken in this initiative, but one of them was giving local authorities the power to ban what they called undesirable use types. So this was things like betting shops, fast food takeaway, vape shops, for example, things that were perceived to have broader negative social externalities that weren't necessarily being priced in. There were maybe too many of them in certain places, and government wanted to give local authorities the power to say, you know what, that's enough. We've got enough of those. It's completely fair and understandable. There are undeniably negative connotations to having a high street that's filled with betting shops. If you have a problem with gambling and you're just trying to get to work, but you pass 5 betting shops on the way to work, you're going to be more tempted than maybe is necessary. So I completely understand why planning authorities want to have those powers. What this research really says, though, is that local authorities need to be careful when applying those powers. So there is a risk that if you do ban these use classes, currently London is sort of in equilibrium, right? It's in balance. It's got a relatively healthy vacancy rate. If you start removing those use classes, you do risk increasing the number of empty shops, because a lot of the time those use classes are in high streets where incomes are lower, there's more deprivation, and maybe it's not possible to support, a Gales instead of your William Hill. It's not what's going to happen.
Yeah.
The William Hill is going to close down and the unit's going to be left empty. And look, maybe that's a positive social good. Maybe that's a decision the local authority are willing to make, and that's fine. But this research really emphasizes that you have to be conscious that these decisions are made within markets and that there may be implications as a result.
Brilliant. Yeah, I completely agree with that. We want to have good policy outcomes, but there are always trade-offs that need to be considered when we're doing that. And if you want less of one thing, you might end up getting less of something else as well, which is a good reminder. Oscar, thank you very much indeed for a canter through the report. You can get it on our website, centreforcities.org. It's called Follow the Money, explaining the performance of London's suburban high streets. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of City Minutes, brought to you by the Centre for Cities. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Podbean by searching Centre for Cities. Please rate and subscribe if you like what you heard. Centre for Cities is an independent think tank dedicated to improving the economies of UK's largest cities and towns. You can follow the Centre on Twitter at Centre for Cities, all one word, or on LinkedIn for the latest on what the Centre is up to. To hear all about our latest reports and briefings and upcoming events, sign up to our fortnightly newsletter via our website, centreforcities.org. If you'd like to get in touch, do tweet us or send an email to info@centreforcities.org.